You don't fail until you're dead or give up. Those are the only two real conditions of failure. It's more just a fear of change. People have such a fear of change that they don't try new things. And I think that impedes a lot of people's growth potential. If you're too afraid of change, then too much of that value that's inside you just stays there. And I personally believe that if you are blessed with skills, ability, and talents, and those talents are legitimately valuable to the world, you have a duty to bring those talents out to the world, because otherwise you are preventing other people from benefiting from what you have learned and know.
The Thomas Green podcast is owned and made possible by Ethical Marketing Service. If your business is struggling with Google or Facebook ads, maybe you're frustrated figuring it out, or there's a performance issue, Ethical Marketing Service has worked on hundreds of accounts and we can help in this area. We offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, and for every direct account we look after, we sponsor a child in a developing nation with food, water and education. If you would like to find out if we can help, it's a free, no salesy consultation call, and the link is in the description. Enjoy the episode. Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Doug Utberg. Doug, welcome.
Great to be here, Thomas.
It is great to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure thing. So I actually spent the first 20 or so years of my career in the technology industry. So I came through university with a degree in finance, and I ultimately ended up going on to get my MBA. And I worked for a giant tech manufacturing company, Intel Corp. I would assume most people who are listening have heard of them. And I worked for them for just shy of 18 years, of course, moving up through different roles, etc. And then I ended up moving over to Lattice Semi because, one of the things, at least, that ends up happening, especially in finance, for a person kind of like me who is, if people can't tell, I'm extroverted. And so extroverts in finance kind of tend to be ducks out of water. So as I'm fond of saying, one of two things happen. Either A, you get put in charge, or B, you get undercut by the people who are in charge because they feel threatened by you. And so what ended up happening to me was you ascend, and then at some point you end up hitting a roadblock. So I was like, all right, I gotta pivot, try something else. So I went to another tech manufacturing company called Lattice Semiconductor. So I live in the Portland, Oregon area. So it's in the United States, way over on the West Coast. It's that, there's 3 states on the West Coast. Washington's the one in the north that has Amazon and Microsoft. Of course, California's on the south that has Hollywood and all the California stuff. Oregon's that state right in the middle, and I'm just south of the Portland area, which is the biggest city in the state. So anyway, going back on, I'm at Lattice Semiconductor, and what I did was I shifted from finance to information technology. Well, I would say sort of, because my last 5-6 years at Intel, I was managing a data system team. And so I ended up becoming the director of the program management office at Lattice Semiconductor, but the chief information officer who hired me, he really didn't like to have to deal with all the budgets and dealing with the finance stuff. So he delegated that to me. So I ended up doing finance again, but from an operational owner perspective, as opposed to a finance support perspective. So anyway, going in about a couple of years or so, he ends up taking early retirement, which of course is corporate speak for management told him that he's being moved out. Someone else gets parachuted in from Silicon Valley, and the first move is to get rid of all the people who were in the old CIO's inner circle. So I was number 1 on the list, and so I got terminated with absolutely no notice on April 20th of 2020. Which if anybody remembers, during that time, there was roughly 40 million overall people who went on unemployment. So that really sucked because, of course, I was trying to apply for roles just like literally everybody else. And so I put in hundreds of applications, probably somewhere between 300 and 400, and just nothing. I think I ended up in 2 interview strings. That for roles that had like over 100 and something applicants, and then I think I ended up close but not quite. So they said thanks but no thanks. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up pivoting out of there, and I ended up starting kind of one of the businesses that I'm involved in right now, which is expense reduction consulting. So what I do is I work with about mid-sized companies to reduce their contract-based costs, but we do it on a success fee basis. So what I'll do is I'll partner with my cost category experts. We'll come in and we'll go and renegotiate your contracts, and then we only get paid after you've achieved savings. Because one of the bugaboos, at least that I have, is that I've seen all kinds of consultants come in. They charge enormous fees, and you have no clue at all whether you're really going to get any real value. And they get paid whether what they do really generates value or not. And in a lot of cases, what will happen is there'll be something valuable that'll come out, but it won't get implemented. So you'll end up paying a whole bunch of money for consultants that put nice presentations together for management to consume, and then it just never goes anywhere. So anyway, kind of coming out of that, one of the things that I did notice about this business, though, is that it's a really, really long sales cycle. So I was like, okay, I need to figure out some things to do in the interim so that, my kids can go to school and, can pay the mortgage and stuff like that. So I've ended up working a contract role for a little while. And then I also moved into the other secondary role that I'm currently doing, which is I'm doing business development for an information technology recruiting and managed services company. So I'm on the one hand, I have my own podcast I run. I have a expense reduction consulting hustle. I have a IT recruiting hustle, and there are two pre-revenue startups that I'm working with to try to see if we can get those off the ground. And so that's a really long explanation for a whole bunch of different balls that I'm juggling in the air right now, kind of re-architecting what my career is going to look like. So with that said, I think in the pre-show, Thomas and I were talking about kind of what topic we wanted to walk through, and for me, what's really been on my mind a lot lately is the idea of just pivoting through setbacks. And so I feel like that's a really relevant topic. It's relevant to just about any existing business owner, aspiring business owner, or even high achieving career person, because there's always setbacks that you have to work through, and figuring out how to do that, I think, is really important.
Thank you for the introduction. Busy man, I can tell. You're a very busy man. One thing that you did say in your introduction was about the fact that you were working for a particular, let's say, individual, and someone he basically got booted out, early retirement,
Yes.
you said, in quotations. And a lot of people went with him, as I understand it. I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit naive in this particular conversation or instance, because let's say if you were the business owner in this particular instance, I know it's a bigger business, obviously, but it would seem counterproductive or negative to a business to just get rid of a load of people who have a load of experience. So in your view, how often does that type of thing happen?
I was going to say that perspective sounds 100% like something an entrepreneur would say. And the difference that I would call out is that the organizational dynamics are really, really different when the decision maker is spending their own money versus when they're spending somebody else's money. So at least, one of the things at least that I've observed is a lot of larger companies fall into what I call the General Electric management paradigm, which is essentially where you have a pyramid of management, right? You have the CEO, you have their staff, they have their staff, they have their staff, and there's this cascading pyramid of management layers. And then you end up having rating and ranking of both individual contributors, first level managers, second level managers, etc. And so at some point, what happens is the way that you ascend in your career stops being about being exceptionally good at whatever your skill set is, and starts being about being exceptionally good at influencing and posturing within that management hierarchy. And so in a lot of cases, the explanation for your question is that when the decision dynamics shift from, okay, I'm spending my money, I need to make sure that I'm deploying it as wisely as possible, to I need to protect my turf, ensure that I'm not getting my potential positional power undermined. That's when that happens.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned the setback, because you suffered a setback there.
Yes.
If someone was about to go through the same thing, let's say they got the news, what advice would you give them in terms of how to deal with that?
So I think the first thing that I would say is that first thing is to really decide, right, what is it that you want with the rest of your career. And so, a part of the inner conflict that I was dealing with was that I'd stayed with a stable corporate career, because I thought it was what you were supposed to do, right? I am a late Gen Xer, and of course, right, we were all trained, right? Okay, go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a good job, have a career, buy a house, buy a car, buy a bigger house, buy a car, have kids, buy a bigger house, buy another car, that kind of stuff. And so as you're going through that cycle, you're, the whole idea of, okay, yeah, I'm going to do my own thing that may or may not work out. That is very foreign to the mindset that's really been drilled into kind of my generation and before. I think a lot of the millennial generation afterwards are a little more flexible that way, which incidentally I actually think is overall productive. But kind of going backward is that just my the way that I had been going about my career was I was like, okay, well, this is what you're supposed to do, right? This is what you're supposed to do. I'm doing it. And now I was kind of, within my mind, right, I've always had some kind of side hustle, whether it was, say, like a real estate investing or trying to get a information marketing company off the ground. I think before I went to work for Intel, I spent a little while selling life insurance and mutual funds, which is really hard, especially because when you're doing it young and broke, all the other people are also young and broke, and so it takes a really long time to get a book of business together. I think while I was in college, I joined on as an Amway distributor, and that ended up being a lot harder than I thought. And so when I had the chance to kind of do the stable corporate thing, I'm like, okay, maybe this is the right thing to do. But I'd say, but ultimately, and this is a really long way of getting to it, is decide what you really want to do, and then decide that you are going to put all your effort into figuring out how to get there, whatever that happens to be. So if you are career oriented, what I would say is, okay, and you hit the street. Well, first of all, now is actually as good a time as you're going to find to be on the street because generally speaking, it's, there's a lot of openings. But even if you're in another unemployment disaster scenario, what I would say is, okay, go onto your social media, probably LinkedIn principally, unfollow everybody, and then find out, okay, what do they say that if your target, say 20 to 30 companies where you would want to work, right? Sector, job, etc. And then go start snooping to find out who are the decision makers who are the people that will be hiring those types of positions at those companies. Figure out who they are, start following them, like every post that they put on that they put on LinkedIn, comment on every post that they put on LinkedIn. After doing that for about 2 to 3 weeks, hit them up on instant message. Some will reply, some won't. The ones that reply, start a conversation string, and then just see if you can continue a conversation. Because if they are not personally hiring somebody, but you get a conversation going and you create value up front, there's a really good chance that they can connect you with somebody else who is. I think the notion of going through a HR based hiring process, if you're anywhere above entry level, is probably more trouble than it's worth, just because you will have to spend an untold amount of time, basically just in wasted effort by filling out resumes, by submitting resumes and filling out applications for jobs that aren't frankly aren't real, because there's for compliance purposes, a lot of companies have to publicly post jobs even if they're most likely to fill internally. So that means there's actually far less available jobs out than you see on all the job boards, because a lot of stuff gets posted externally even though there's no chance of bringing in somebody external. And so it ends up being a really confusing environment. So okay, that's if you decide you're going the career path. If you decide you're going the entrepreneur route, it's a little more complicated. You will almost certainly have to pivot through 5 or 6 times. You might need to end up picking up a day job to finance your entrepreneurial journey, or go get financing or something. But the main thing I would say is really decide what it is that you want to do, and then decide that no matter what, come hell or high water, you're going to figure it out. Because I think that's probably the single most important factor, because there's always going to be weird stuff you have to work through, and there will always be new skills you have to acquire, and how you think something works at the beginning and how it actually ends up working when it's sustainable, they might be kind of similar, but they will almost certainly not be the same.
Thank you for the answer. I've heard it a couple of times about the sending hundreds of applications and getting
Yeah.
nothing in response, and how it's a bit broken. Do you think there's a bit of a, I don't know, an opportunity there for someone to come in and, I don't know, solve that problem?
Well, you're touching on some hot button issues here. So there's a couple of things about artifacts of the current way business happens that I think are ultimately going to become obsolete. One is like I was talking about with those multiple layers of middle management. I think legacy companies that have essentially monopoly pricing power will be able to sustain that model for a little while, but the growth companies, the ones that are smart, won't replicate it. They will have very, very thin management, and and they'll be they'll be operating kind of based on more of a self motivation model as opposed to the assumption that you need to have managerial oversight of everybody, and then oversight of managers, and then oversight of those second level managers, etc. I think that's one paradigm that's changing. I think another one is that, yeah, it's like you said, I think the way that companies source headcount is fundamentally is going to need to change. And a part of this, at least in my observation, is that there's a little bit of a kind of turf overlap, what I would say turf war role confusion going on. And that is that in almost every company on the face of the planet, human resources owns recruiting. But there's a fundamental conflict here because human resources, similar to like accounting, is a compliance role, not necessarily a sales role. And recruiting is a sales activity. And so I think what ends up happening is when you run a sales activity in with compliance-based processes, you end up creating a lot of roadblocks, and you end up introducing a whole lot of unintended bias, which I think is what's a big hot button issue right now. And so of course, since I'm involved in the recruiting end, one of the things that I think actually would be probably smart for a lot of companies would be to partner with some strategic recruiters. I understand you're going to have to pay a placement fee, but in a lot of cases, being able to bring on qualified candidates in a short amount of time, the time value that you will gain in many cases will exceed that placement fee, because you have to understand that anytime you're running a process internally, whoever is doing that is not doing something else. And so not only do you have the delay in what you're trying to do, you have the other things that aren't being done. And I think this is another kind of one of my personal bugaboos is that in a lot of traditional kind of corporate management sort of basically assumes that internal people's time is free, and that your internal people, what they do doesn't really matter. Because if it did, you would have them focus on it. But what everybody does is they go, okay, well, we want you to handle this and that other thing over there. So, all right, well, does that, is this, so what you're saying is what you want to get done is really not that important, because if it was, you would either, you either bring on somebody temporary to have that be their sole focus, or or you would take whoever that you're assigning it to and not split their duties. But I think this is one of the other, as I call it, the mini management delusions, is that there's a management delusion that people's time is free. And if you assign something to somebody okay, that means it's fine. My job's done. It's like, well, no, if you take somebody's effort and cut it in half, they will take something that they were doing well, and they'll probably do two things in a mediocre way. And if mediocre is all you need, then I suppose you can get away with that. And there's actually a lot of businesses where mediocre is all they need. And so what people think is that they can just keep splitting people's effort and get mediocre output, across a broad array of issues. Of course, the problem is if you compound that over time, you eventually become uncompetitive.
Coming back to your experience of the fact that you've got both entrepreneurship in your,
Yeah.
shall we say, CV, and
Yeah.
also working in a big corporate. And you mentioned the fact that at some point it becomes not about allocation of the best resources or getting the best return, but sort of protecting, I don't know, upper
Yeah.
management protecting themselves type thing.
Yes.
What could you do if you were in business and
Mhm.
you wanted to avoid that type of scenario? What would be the best way to go about doing that in your view?
That's a really good question. So, my intuition there is that the most important thing is to make sure that you are limiting the number of layers of management that you put in place. And I think the way that you do that is by make sure that as many things as possible are documented and can be boiled down to processes. And wherever you can automate with technology, try to do that, because what you really want to be able to do is you want to be able to have an adequate budget so that you can source and compensate exceptional people, A player quality people who can really self-manage and don't need to have a lot of oversight to produce exceptional results. I think that's actually probably the one, at least, and again, this is just my opinion, but in my view, one of the biggest weak spots of a lot of companies is that their structure is really designed to recruit and promote B players. Because in a lot of companies, again, you get recognized and promoted based on what you achieve, but also how well you comply with expectations. Well, A players don't comply; they just create value. And A players don't always ascend. In a lot of cases, they just leave. They'll either leave for another role, or they'll leave to start their own thing. And so what ends up happening is you can get a lot of cases where you have senior management where they'll see an A player, but the A player is not isn't complying with the regulations, and they're saying, hey, what's wrong with them? They're not following the rules. You need to get them in line. It's like, okay, no, if you have an A player in sales and that and they're your top salesperson, as long as they're not breaking any legal or ethical rules, just put a wall around them and let them do their thing. That's probably one of the best things is, if you get to where you can recruit and retain A players, make sure that they have those legal and ethical boundaries, but otherwise let them do their thing. Because if you try to overmanage them, you will reduce their effectiveness, and B, push them somewhere else.
That's a great answer. I wanted to follow up on your the fact that you're in expense reduction as well, and I think it's cool that you do the performance pricing. But I did want to ask how you go about mitigating, ensuring that when you do that work, then it's going to be worth your while. Is there some sort of assessment that you go through in order to ensure that business has the ability to reduce expenses?
Yeah, sure. Excellent question. And so typically what we do is, usually when we start a project, we'll put a materiality stricture around the type of contracts we're looking at. So for example, let's say that we're looking at, say, a telecommunications contract. Generally speaking, we'll want to be looking at least $100,000 to $200,000 a year, just because generally speaking, smaller contracts tend to be a little more difficult to unwind. Whereas there's other situations where, like for example, if you're looking at banking fees, in a lot of cases, your materiality for looking at expense reduction is much lower. It's around, I don't know, like 40, 50,000 a year or something like that. But in either case, what we do is, we end up taking a risk when we go in, because we might not be able to generate material savings. But on the other hand, when you do a success fee based model, your compensation is unbounded. And I think that's that's the flip side, right? Is you take that front end risk, but in exchange for that, if you were able to generate exceptional value, in my view, you have the right to be compensated for all of that.
Yeah, higher. If you're taking more risk, then that means a higher price, right?
Correct.
And how do you find that business?
Yeah. So generally speaking, the best way to find these types of opportunities is usually through networking with the decision makers, most likely in finance, or most often in finance. And so this has been tremendously difficult during COVID, because virtual events are completely useless for professional services networking. And so in a lot of cases, at least what I've had to do is I've had to really get creative with the way that I reach out to people. And like one of the ways that I do that is through a podcast, so that, because by having my own show, it gives me a platform to be able to invite decision makers to come on for interviews and then start engaging in a conversation. And so I think that, for a lot of people who are looking to go an entrepreneurial route, what they will need to figure out how to do is to figure out how are you going to do business development, understanding that people don't answer their phone anymore, and your email open rates are going down. And the answer is not necessarily to send twice as many emails.
Well, that's me. Thank you for answering the question. That is me being a fantastic host, because what I've asked you a question which has a double meaning. What it actually meant was, how do you find it? How do you find being in that business? What's the business like? But I
Oh,
can
gotcha.
totally understand that it meant the same thing.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, let's see. So as far as my retrospect, well, if I was going back to when I first joined, I probably would not have done it the way that I did. And the reason why is that the difficult part in any type of professional services consulting type of business is business development and client acquisition. So when I started, I had no audience. I had some people I was connected to on LinkedIn. I didn't have a show. I didn't have, I didn't have an active channel on like YouTube. I wasn't active on Facebook or any of the social platforms. I didn't really have an audience who was bought in and engaged to me. And so the thing is that in a lot of cases, you'll have somebody who gets separated, and the franchise consultants will descend on them like vultures, trying to get them to buy into something or another. And almost all the franchises have the same thing in common, which is that they have a excellent, amazing execution model, and they have a very, very underdeveloped to non-existent business acquisition model. But if you're in professional services, business acquisition is somewhere between half and three-quarters of all the value. It is extremely easy to find people who can do execution. It is really, really, really hard to get people to say, okay, yes, I want to work with you and I'm willing to write you a check. And so I think that's probably that's honestly the thing that I'm still working through, is really getting a sustainable, repeatable client acquisition process together that I can tune up or down, as I need to scale revenue. Because of course the second level thought is that, okay, step one is, okay, you start by scratching around, you find a few clients, great, making some revenue. Step two is to say, okay, if you get to where you want to grow your business, you need to be able to say, okay, what are the levers that I need to pull? Where do I invest capital to be able to grow my revenue base, so that I'll be able to know in advance that I can hire people? Because if you grow your revenue base without support, you'll burn yourself out. But if you bring on support without growing your revenue base, you'll go bankrupt. And so there's this bridge point where you really have to have your marketing and business development and client acquisition processes dialed in almost perfectly, because once you do that, then you can say, okay, now it's time to bring in help. Now I can start codifying these processes. I can turn on the spigot and start bringing in revenue, because now I'm able to handle it. Otherwise you'll fall off the fence one way or the other, by burning yourself out, or by taking on a bunch of costs you can't pay.
Have you got any favorite examples about, let's say you go into a business and you reduce a load of expenses and what that means to the client?
Sure. So for example, one client that I worked with is actually my best friend. He has a dental practice, and what we were able to do was we've been able to reduce his dental supply costs by about 17% or so. And so that's actually been pretty meaningful to him, because what's been happening is, because the market for dental hygienists has actually really tightened up, and he's been needing to increase the compensation of new people that he brings in. Well, anybody who runs a small business knows, once you pay a new person more, you have to pay your existing people more, because if you don't, then you're going to lose all of them. Because at any time that you have a business, you just have to assume that everyone knows what everyone else makes, even though technically it's supposed to be confidential. Just assume that everybody knows how much everybody else is being paid. And if you have any disequities at all, people will figure out about it, and it will make them very, very, very unhappy. And so, because that's actually, incidentally, one of the reasons why I like doing the expense reduction consulting, because it's working with a lot of the smaller businesses, and it also helps to provide them the capital that they need to reinvest in their business, so that they can either stay viable if you have an inflationary environment, or they can afford to invest in growth.
Thank you for that. This one's actually a selfish one, and
Okay.
whenever I have anyone on the show and they've got military experience, I like to ask about how that, should we say, translates into business. So, can you tell me about the Marine Corps and
Sure.
how you've used that experience?
Sure. So I was in the Marine Corps Reserves for 6 years, from beginning of 1997 through 2002. And of course, as far as direct experience, I was a combat engineer, so it's basically shooting things and blowing stuff up, which doesn't have as many civilian applications. But I think the really important things that I learned, I would say, is the ability to adapt and improvise. Just because whenever you're dealing, if you're whenever you're dealing with a situation, especially in the Marines, which is far and away the least well funded of all branches of the military. So that means just about any mission that we're working on, you will never have everything you need to complete it. So in a lot of cases, you need to change plans, you need to adapt, you need to figure out another way to acquire the materials or manpower, whatever that you need. And so I think that there's, at least in my view, I think that that notion that scarcity breeds resourcefulness, and figuring out how to work your way through situations where you don't have all the pieces that you need, I think is really important, because there's a tendency for, on a lot of people to say, oh, hey, I don't have the materials I need. I'm going to stop until I get supply. It's like, no, just figure it out. Figure it out. It's, in business, right? We get paid very, very well to figure out problems that other people think are unsolvable. And, that's, and because if you're going to take one thing away, is that, if you develop the skill of figuring out problems that other people think can't be solved, there will be no limit to the demand for your time.
Would you say that's sort of within your personality as a result of that experience?
I would say personality, yes. Of course, right. Figuring out unsolvable problems is a lot easier than it sounds. But yes, I would say that resolve to figure things out is most definitely ingrained. But I think it's also learnable too, because it's principally where you just have to say, okay, I'm going to intentionally put myself in an uncomfortable situation, and I'm going to figure it out. And if you get really good at that, then eventually you'll just kind of overcome that fear of, that fear of unknown situations. I mean, if you think about it, right, from an evolutionary perspective, human beings have an ingrained fear of the unknown, because, right, you know, millions and millions of years ago, if somebody heard a rustling in a bush next to them, there are some people who thought, okay, hey, it might be a tiger. I need to be really cautious. Other people who thought, okay, well, it's probably just the wind. Well, enough of those people who thought it was just the wind got eaten by tigers, to where the people who, to where there's an evolutionary bias toward caution and change aversion. I mean, and I think as business people and entrepreneurs, being willing to lean into that uncertainty over time will give you a sustainable competitive edge, because despite what they tell you, most people just don't like to do it.
So it's an interesting point, coming back to the military for a second, because I heard
Yeah.
it said that once you realize, I can't remember who it was exactly, once you realize, the decisions that you make or the risks that you face are not like, bullets flying by your head or something, then
Yes.
you're not too afraid of making a wrong business decision. Does that
Yeah.
resonate with you at all?
Yes, exactly. And well, I mean, and the way that I would think about it also, because I was actually very fortunate in that my enlistment ended 1 month before my entire unit was activated and sent over to the Gulf. Now, of course, if I did get activated, of course I go. That's how the game works. But I was able to kind of go out and resume my civilian life. But I would say the kind of the non-military equivalent of that is that okay, when you go through that. Uh, you know, that forced separation from your career path, and you have to pivot. In my view, kind of having gone through that, I sort of feel a little unbreakable, in that I'm like, okay, I kind of feel like whatever I'm dealing with, I'm not concerned about being able to handle it. It might not go exactly the way that I want. It might take longer to unfold than the way that I want. But the world's not going to end. And I think that there's just people carry so much of a fear of, I wouldn't even call it a fear of failure, because as long as you're alive and you're still trying, you haven't failed. You don't fail until you're dead or give up. Those are the only two real conditions of failure. It's more just a fear of change. People have such a fear of change that they don't try new things. And I think that actually that impedes a lot of people's growth potential, because there's so many people out there that, as I would say, I'm bringing in some recent pop culture references. My daughter is a big fan of Andrew Garfield and the recent show Tick Tick Boom about Jonathan Larson and the evolution of the show Rent. Well, for everybody who's not familiar with the background, he went through a long, long, long string of rejections and unfortunately had a massive aortic aneurysm the day before the Rent debuted on Broadway. But anyway, what he had to do was right. He was determined that the art and music inside him wasn't going to stay there. That he was going to figure out how to bring it out. And I think that if you're too afraid of change, then too much of that value that's inside you just stays there. And I personally believe that kind of we as people have if we are blessed with skills, abilities, and talents, we have a duty, if you're, or let me back up, if you are blessed with skills, ability, and talents, and those talents are legitimately valuable to the world, you have a duty to bring those talents out to the world, because otherwise you are preventing other people from benefiting from what you have learned and know. And I think that when you think about it in that context, it you know it you know it at least in my view, I find that there's a motivating aspect to that because if you think of it less in the, hey, I want to do a thing, and more like, hey, I have a duty to help other people benefit from what I've been able to learn.
Great answer. Have you had any, should we say, discipline drilled into your philosophy, or did that not really apply?
Well, so, and I would say, yeah, there's a yes to both, and because I think the discipline is that you have to put in the work. However, I think there's in a lot of cases, some people get really rigid with their discipline. I tend to be a little less rigid just because I'm not, my business is not currently at a point where I'm like, okay, here's the step 1 to 50 playbook. Just repeat, just put this on infinite repeat and everything will be fine. There's a lot of stuff I'm still figuring out. And so I think that when you're going through that phase, right, I think there's a discipline to say, hey, I'm going to keep going until I figure it out. Then once you do figure it out, there's a saying, okay, I'm going to stay focused and scale it and not get distracted. So I think there's two phases of discipline when you're running your business.
Well, thank you for taking that detour with me. I enjoyed the topic, so I appreciate it.
No problem.
What are your goals at the moment?
I'm currently in getting to that sustainable business development acquisition process whereby I can say, okay, once I get to where I know that if I do X, Y, and Z at a certain order, that I will bring in a certain amount of revenue. Because a part of my financial discipline is I am not going to invest in scaling my business until I know that I can generate enough revenue to offset those costs. So I'm currently going through establishing and documenting those strictures so that I can, so that I can ascend. Because I think the quickest way to tank your business is if you try to grow too fast without the ability to finance it. Now of course I'm not VC backed, so of course if you're spending someone else's money, whatever, party on. But I'm spending my own money, and I just as soon not have to go bankrupt. So I'm being very cautious about it.
That's perfectly reasonable. I have spoken to someone about instances where scaling, let's say it happened too quickly, and there's some reputational damage that can come with that. So 100% understand.
Case studies ad nauseum in finance about what they call the growing broke case studies. And usually it's where you have a company where they're trying to grow very rapidly. And usually what ends up happening is they end up having to put a whole bunch of cash into either growing and maintaining inventory or in extending credit through accounts receivable. And then eventually they get to where they essentially just become insolvent because they have a whole lot of assets on their books that they can't convert to cash to pay the bills. And so that's the thing is that, over the long term, right, profitability is what you need to track. Over the short term, it is all about cash flow. Because if you don't have cash, if your cash flow isn't there, then none of the other metrics matter. You will be insolvent.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to end there. So, have you got any closing thoughts for us today?
I think closing thought is really just reiterating the notion of, just really think about what it is that you want, the path that you want for the rest of your business life to take, and then just go on, develop the determination that whatever it takes to get there, you're going to figure it out. Because I think that just that determination in itself will create the resiliency that you need. It's similar to, I'm fond of saying that, whenever people ask me about, say, becoming a new parent. So I have my two kids. My daughter just turned 16. My son just turned 13. So I was, a new parent a little while ago. But like anybody who's, say, like becoming a new parent, they always ask, okay, what do I need to know? I go, in my view, the principal determinant is, are you willing to subordinate any and everything else in your life to taking care of your kids? If the answer to that question is yes, you're ready. Whatever you find, whatever you run into, you'll figure out a way through it. If your answer is, well, wait a minute, no, but I still want to, that's it. You're not ready. You're not ready. It's, because you will end up getting into a big, you'll end up hitting a really major time conflict, and you will end up feeling resentful. Are you willing to subordinate everything else to your kids? Similar to your business, right? Your business or career. To are you willing to keep persevering to figure out what what the exact formula is for what you want to achieve, regardless of how many times you have to pivot and go through setbacks? And if the answer to that question is yes, you're ready. If the answer to that question is, oh, I'm just trying it out, you save yourself a lot of time and heartache, because it's, you have to develop that resolve that whatever you have to do, you will figure it out.
That's a great answer. I mean, it makes perfect sense in relation to kids, but I've never heard it said that way in relation to business before. And that's a great question to ask people if they're willing to do whatever it takes and exchange whatever is required in order to meet that outcome, if you like. And I've noticed clarity is a big thing for you, right?
Yes. Yes. Clarity is very important. And clarity doesn't come at one shot. As I've found, right, as I've unpacked what I'm doing more, the clarity has, I've always thought that I was clear. And every time when I look back 2 weeks, I'm like, no, I really didn't have an idea what I was going after. And, because I think that, because like one of the things that you brought up that I want to unpack a little more is kind of balancing between, say, your personal and business priorities. Because on the one hand, you say, okay, if I'm going to do whatever it takes to run business, does that mean that I can't take care of your family, can't take care of my family? I go, well, that depends. The question is, right, if you have these two priorities, how do you juxtapose them between one another? So for me, I'm a family comes first kind of person. So what that means is the big rocks in my life jar are family. And so at some point, the time that I can put into my business cuts off. And that means I'm going to grow more slowly. And I've mentally decided I am going to keep pivoting through, figuring out how to run my business in a way that works around my family and can still be successful, which is going to inevitably take longer than if I could pour 90 hours a week into it. But I can't, and I'm not going to. So that means I have to figure out a way to substitute intelligence for time.
Yeah, and in some instances, I mean, that can actually be more beneficial, right? So if you're willing to delegate, that can help the business grow quicker than if you were holding on to things.
Yeah.
You found that to be the case?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, and because another thing that I'm trying to remember the source. I can't remember the source, so I can quote it accurately. But there was one person I read where they said making a lot of money actually isn't that hard. Making a lot of money while still having a life that you want to live is extremely hard. Because like, if you're willing to put in 80, 90, 100-hour weeks, there's a lot of things you can do, or, if you're willing to go 90% travel, there's a lot of stuff you can do where you can make a ton of money. It's a very good bet that you will be very miserable and or substance addicted after not too much time. The trick is figuring out how do you become, financially and personally successful in a way that meshes with what you want for your personal life. And I think the only way you can really accomplish that is to say, okay, this is what the family rocks look like in my life jar, right? So the analogy is that if you have a jar, right, and you're trying to figure out, how do you fill it up? What you do is you start by putting the big rocks in, then you put the middle-sized rocks in, you fill the rest with the sand. And so the big rocks are the things that are most important in your life. And so if the big rocks in your life jar are your family, you say, okay, this is, say, all right, this is how much time I'm going to need for my family. This is how much is left for my other stuff. I have to figure out how to get to where I want to go inside that time and resource envelope. And I'm a big believer that I won't say that there are no unsolvable problems, but that there are very few unsolvable problems. And so most things that we think are a time or resource problem are actually a knowledge problem. So for example, if I say I don't have time to build my business, I say, all right, that's a time problem. It's actually not. It's a knowledge problem. It's I don't know how to build my business in 20 hours or less a week. Or we'd say, okay, I don't have enough money. That's a funding problem. No, it's not. It's a knowledge problem. It's saying I don't know how to get funding that does not risk bankrupting my family. There are different ways of looking at things, but when you start looking at your business problems as knowledge problems that can be figured out, I think this is what feeds into the infinite perseverance hypothesis, which is that, okay, if you have to start by believing that any business problem you run into can be figured out, and it can be figured out in a way that is consistent with what your life goals are. If you go in with that stricture, I think that's a really important part of persevering forward, because as the most hackneyed example is when Roger Bannister broke the 4 minute mile. Right, up until then they thought it was physically impossible, and then I think after he broke it, it was like a month later when somebody else broke it. And since then, there's been like 1,500 people who have registered sub 4 minute miles. So, once people convince themselves that something can be done, they figure out a way to do it. And so, a lot of what you have to do in business is convince yourself that what you're trying to do can be done, and all you have to do is figure out how.
Well, just as a takeaway, I love that phrase, infinite perseverance. I've never heard that before. I feel like
Yeah,
if you just have that
it actually
phrase,
just came up right off the top of my head. I'm going to brand it though. I'm writing it down as
I
soon as
love
we're
it.
done talking.
That deserves a trademark, that one. Um, just as because I think it's highly beneficial for those that don't have clarity.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone in terms of if they were like, yeah, I noticed should we say the benefits of being clear or knowing what I want, but I really don't know yet. What do you say to that person?
Let's see. So I think generally speaking, I think that if you're pursuing business, the business that if you're pursuing business clarity, in my experience, the best business clarity is when you are creating something that you desperately needed at some point in your life. And so, for example, the vision that I am moving toward with my business, and I'm nowhere close to there yet, but the vision that I'm moving toward with my business is to give to either give value, really value obsessed leaders inside businesses the tools they need to transform their bureaucratic business, their kind of old style bureaucracy business to a world class business, because that's something that I fought against my whole corporate career, or giving somebody the tools who is a new entrepreneur, either as a either you're either fresh out of college or you're a corporate convert and you don't really know what to do with this entrepreneur thing, the full tool set to go from not really knowing what you're planning on doing to building and running a successful business. Those are the two big problems that I've encountered within my career that I really have a passion for going about solving. And I've had to make it really, I guess, I've had to, I guess you'd say, what is it? I've had to come to peace with the fact that that's going to take me a really long time to architect and market the solution to those. And it will probably end up looking different than I think it will today. But I think that the people who are most successful are the people who go about and develop a passion to solve a problem, to create a solution that they desperately needed at some point in their life. Because I think that when you have a successful business, again, all due respect to Simon Sinek, who has a number one global bestseller, Start with Why. I actually think that if you have a small business or even a large one for that matter, you actually need to start with who. Who is it that your business is designed for? Whose problem are you solving? Because I think that if you're really, really clear on that who, and in most cases, for most entrepreneurs, that who will be you at some prior point in your life. And in a lot of cases, that's actually really productive because that means you know exactly how you felt. You know exactly what you needed, and you knew exactly how every other solution that was available to you failed. But it's get really clear on that who, because if you know that who, that then you can create that proverbial client avatar and use that to answer every other client facing question in your business.
Love that answer. Thank you. Doug, if
No
people
problem.
want to know more, where do they go?
Sure. So my podcast is called Terminal Value. So it's terminalvaluepodcast.com. Or just look up Terminal Value in iTunes or Spotify or any of the other podcast aggregators. And my website is just terminalvalue.biz. That's terminalvalue.biz.
Thank you for that. And for everyone watching, please review the links in the description. And Doug, thanks for being a great
Yeah.
guest today.
Yes. And by all means, please check out the podcast. And I would love it if people would please leave an honest review. Hopefully, it'll be 5 stars, but I'd rather it be honest than it be good.
All right. Well, thank you for your contribution. And again, thanks for being a great guest.
Thank you very much.